Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I hope you've been having a wonderful weekend. I have been having an okay weekend, except that I have been battling this cold that started in my chest and then moved to my sinuses, so if I sound a little stuffy, that is why. And I don't know about you, but there's something about having a cold in the winter that, while I don't enjoy it, just seems more normal than having a cold in the spring, especially spring in Northern California, where it's been between 80 and 90 for the last week. There's just, in the winter, you can wrap up in blankets and drink hot tea, and it just feels more normal. I don't like having spring or summer colds. They seem wrong. Besides the fact that I feel terrible, it's nice outside. You can go and sit outside and soak up some vitamin D, which is lovely, but it just seems wrong. Anyway, that's how my weekend has been going. I hope your weekend has been going better than that. Let's talk about some books, a series of books this time. As you can see from the title of this episode, I want to talk about a series of books called Septimus Heap. It's actually a series of 7 books by author Angie Sage. I usually just refer to it as the Septimus Heap series, but looking on Amazon, it's also referred to as the Wizard Apprentice series. So the first book in the series is called Magic. Each of the titles is spelled, most of them with a Y, where you would not expect one. So Magic, M-A-G-Y-K. There's Physic with a Y. There's Flight with a Y. All sorts of interesting spellings. The series is recommended for about middle grade readers, grades 4 through 8, so that gives you an idea of the age group. I discovered it on a lot of lists that say, what should I read, the titles of which are, what should I read now that I've finished Harry Potter? Or if you loved Harry Potter, then you should read these books. And my husband is always looking for new series. He much prefers series over just single books. He just likes the story to go on for longer, so we're always looking for series. And we kept encountering this one. And then my parents and my brother had all read it, and they kept asking if we had read it yet, and we hadn't. So I finally decided I needed to sit down and get my rear end in order. And I actually listened to it on audiobook, as I have been known to do lately, because it fits into my schedule a little bit better. But as I said, it's a seven book series. The first one is called Magic, and let me give you the description, at least, of the first book. Septimus Heap, the 7th son of the 7th son, disappears the night he is born, pronounced dead by the midwife. That same night, the baby's father, Silas Heap, comes across an abandoned child in the snow, a newborn girl with violet eyes. Who is this mysterious baby girl, and what really happened to the Heap's beloved son, Septimus? The first book in this enthralling series by Angie Sage leads readers on a fantastic journey filled with quirky characters and magical charms, potions, and spells. Magic is the original story of lost and rediscovered identities, rich with humor and heart. Okay, so that's the description of the first book, and of course there are 7, and I can't give you too many things that would give too many things away, but you get that sort of magical sense because it's the 7th son of a 7th son, and you kind of get that this is going to be someone important. There's a lot of very classic fantasy elements in this book. You've got characters who don't seem like much at first and who get sent on these seemingly impossible quests. You've got cases of mistaken identity. You've got some really annoying bad guys, or really annoying people who aren't necessarily bad guys, but they annoy the snot out of you anyway. There's some teenagers in here who are very, very, very teenage-like. So the book starts with what you hear about the midwife declaring Septimus Heap dead, with Silas Heap finding the baby in the snow, and then we fast forward to 10 years later. The baby in the snow is celebrating her 10th birthday, and things take off from there. There's, it's recommended for readers of Harry Potter, but it's, as it should be, very different from Harry Potter. There is magic in it, but wizards are a group of people who do study magic. You can be born into a wizarding family, but it doesn't mean that you will be a wizard. So in that way, it's kind of like Harry Potter. There's not necessarily a school for magic like Hogwarts, and there's other types of magic. So there are witches who don't exactly do magic per se, but they do charms and potions. There's a differentiation between witches and wizards. There's also something called a hermetic scribe. There are the scribes who do a lot of translating, who do a lot of spell work, or work on spells, I should say. So if you have a spell that needs translating, you take it to the hermetic scribes. If you have a spell that is not working properly, you take it to the hermetic scribe. So there's all these different categories of people, which I found really fascinating. Throughout the 7 books, the characters grow and change. Septimus Heap is the 7th son of a 7th son, so there are 6 Heap older brothers in this book, and I will tell you that the baby girl's name is Jenna. So Jenna grows up with these 6 Heap brothers, and you can imagine what that's like when you grow up in a large family in a small house with 6 very noisy brothers. The Heap brothers are a motley collection of very interesting characters. You get to know some of them better than others. The oldest one, Simon, definitely has some growing pains, and won't go too much into that because you should read and find out what's going on with Simon. The writing is funny. It's got some great humor in it. It's got some parts, like I said, where some of the characters, I'm gonna go back to a Harry Potter analogy. For those of you who have read Harry Potter, maybe you'll understand this or may have felt something similar. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry is whiny. And we find out that there's reasons for that, but he is so kind of annoying in that book. Like, you just want to reach through the pages and shake him and say, could you stop acting like this? Part of it is that you're an adolescent, and part of it is that, you got Voldemort in your head. But reading that book, because I do not quite an annual reread, but almost an annual reread. And whenever I get to Order of the Phoenix, I'm like, ugh, can I just skip this book? But I never do. There are characters like that, and there are sections of the book that are like that, where you're like, okay, I know these are growing pains, but you are driving me a little bit crazy, and I would just like for you to stop now, please. But she writes it in a way that you see that the characters are human, and they're not just always happy-go-lucky. Things happen, and they don't always react to them in perfectly appropriate ways. They get cranky, they get snarky. Septimus and Sarah Heap as parents are loving and ditzy as heck. They have their faults and their quirks. Definitely loving, but not perfect paragons of parenting. Let's just go with some alliteration there. And actually that makes them a little bit more lovable, although sometimes if you think about like growing up with them, you'd be like, whew, well, okay, that would be interesting. They aren't terribly organized. They aren't terribly neat. There's some scenes where people are horrified by the state of their home. So yeah, you get Jenna, you get the Heap brothers, and you get all of these adventures. Now, you can understand with cases of mistaken identity, and that's said in the description, and a series called, that's referred to as Septimus Heap, and I'm just going to tell you that Septimus Heap does not die in the first book. There are 7 books. You can't have a series of 7 books named after Septimus Heap if he dies in the first chapter. You do have to figure out who he is, what's happened to him, where he went, etc. And there are cases of mistaken identity in there. But yes, Septimus does show up in all 7 books. Again, I don't think I've given anything away, because you cannot have a series named after Septimus Heap and not have him be alive in it. Although there are a lot of ghosts in the book, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment when we come back from break. So you're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, where I am speaking about the Septimus Heap, or the Wizard Apprentice series, and I just gave kind of a major spoiler, but I don't think it's really that much of a spoiler if you are, if you pay attention to these things in books, and if you see that the entire series is named after Septimus Heap. Anyway, I mentioned ghosts. Interesting thing about ghosts in this. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of afterlife beyond in this series. Once you're dead, you come back as a ghost, and that's just it. You can appear to humans if you want to, but you don't have to. There are rules of ghosthood, one of which is that you have to spend the first year and a day of your ghosthood exactly where you died. So one person dies on someone's couch in one of the books, and she stays there. She has to stay there for a year and a day on that couch, much to the consternation of the person whose couch she died on, because they didn't get along and now they are forced to be together. So you have to spend the first year and a day, after which you can go not anywhere. You can only go to places that you had been to in life. So if you try to go into, let's say, a house that you had never entered in life, you'll be expelled. You can be passed through, which apparently is very unpleasant for the ghosts, which I can imagine. So I found this really interesting because you get characters. There's actually a fairly main character who is a ghost. He used to be an extraordinary wizard. He is killed at the beginning of the book, and he comes back as a ghost, and he continues to mentor his apprentice, who is now the extraordinary wizard, Marcia Overstrand. And he, even though he's a ghost, he plays a very large role in the books. Gives some great advice. He, Jenna Heap refers to him as Uncle Arthur, and he is, kind of a fascinating character who is a ghost. And there are ghosts in other books of this sort, other fantasy books. I just thought that this was an interesting perspective on them. The ghosts are, there's one character who is a seer. She can see ghosts whether they appear to her or not. And from her perspective, they are just ghosts everywhere, which has to be a really interesting way to go through life, seeing all of the death around you, because she can see ghosts regardless of whether they choose to appear to her or not. Very interesting. Plus, her name is Snorri Snorrelson, which just made me laugh every time I heard that name, Snorri Snorrelson. She appears, I think, starting in the second book, maybe. But yeah, Snorri Snorrelson. Okay, so I did listen to these on audiobook, and 7 books. First book is read by Alan Cordiner. Let me double check that name. Give me just 1 second while I look. Yes, Alan Cordiner, Corduner, is the narrator, and then 2 through 7 are narrated by Gerard Doyle. So Alan is fine. He didn't thrill me as a narrator. My husband really didn't like him. He didn't feel like he differentiated the voices enough. But I did then appreciate that the remaining 6 books had the same narrator, and Gerard Doyle, I think, did a great job. He You can tell who's speaking before the speaker is identified. He does a really nice job, and I always like audiobooks because then I get things pronounced that, maybe they're not pronounced correctly according to what was in the author's mind, but I don't have to try to figure them out. Words that, I can look at and go, I have absolutely no idea how to pronounce that. But Jared Doyle just does it for me. He is reminiscent of the narrator of the Harry Potter books. There were times when he did some voices that I was like, man, that sounds like Hagrid, or, that sounds like so-and-so from Harry Potter. It's not the same narrator, but he's up there. He's good, like the Harry Potter narrator. So if you are an audiobook fan, you will like this. If you want to read the series, that's great too. They are illustrated, which is fun. They are for 4th through 8th grade. So you get some younger readers, and younger books sometimes have pictures. Older books for older folks sometimes have pictures in them as well, but I think that's always fun when there are pictures, so you can start visualizing some things that you might not have otherwise. They are kind of line drawings, black and white, but very detailed and very nicely done. The illustrator is Mark Zug. I'm not familiar with him that much, but looking through the books, he does a nice job. And so each chapter starts with an illustration and gives you an idea of, what's going to happen in that chapter. So, man, I wish I could give you some spoilers. So the plot carries through all 7 books, but it takes some turns that I didn't expect. Like, there were some things that were wrapped up in the first book that I thought probably would carry through the rest. And they do in a certain extent, but not in the way that I expected. So things that are set in motion in the first book definitely carry through to the 7th book, but not in characters or in the plots that I necessarily expected. So there's some people who take turns toward being not so nice that I didn't necessarily expect. And the bad guy that you think may be the bad guy throughout kind of is, kind of isn't. So that's interesting. But that bad guy definitely sets in motion for other villains to come in and continue that work. There's one thing that really bugged me that felt like a major plot hole. So there was an incident with Jenna, and again, I don't want to give too much away. So there's an incident that she was very, very concerned about, and she wanted to get fixed. She went to great lengths to get the solution to the problem at hand, and then nothing was mentioned for 2 books, 3 books, I can't even remember. And it does get explained as to why it's not mentioned for that length of time, but during that length of time, I kept thinking, did the author just forget? This is a huge thing that she worked so hard to describe. I'm so confused. Like I said, it does get explained, and it does get explained as to why it hasn't been brought up in 2 or 3 books, but I felt like that little bit of explanation could have been given better earlier. So there's a couple of things like that I think, you could have given me that earlier. Everything does get wrapped up, which I always appreciate, but there were times as I was going through the books where I kept thinking, have we forgotten this? This seems like a major plot. Why are we just going on about things and not paying attention to this one fact? There's another point in the book where I feel like we just kind of left a character behind and kind of willy-nilly, and that gets resolved as well. But I was at the time I was like, really, you're just gonna go off and not even care? So yeah, there were some moments where I just felt like, okay, that could have been handled better. But overall, it didn't detract from the story as a whole, and I didn't feel like it didn't make me want to stop reading or stop listening, as the case may be. So, and maybe other people it wouldn't bother. Maybe it feels more natural to other people as they go through. I can only tell you my experience. So Couple more things to talk about with the Septimus Heap series, but we are going to take our second break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my ramblings about Septimus Heap. I so wish that I could give you a million spoilers, or that we could have a book group for those of you who have read it, and we could talk about the things that I loved, that bugged me, that I want to, spit out and talk about. I'll just try to give you some more things that I loved. It's about magic, which is always fun. It's about quests that seem impossible, but and have unlikely heroes. It is about the characters. Angie Sage does a really great job of developing the characters, and we grow with them through the 7 books. So obviously, there's many, many recurring characters, and several of them start out very young. Like I said, Jenna, we start out pretty much on her 10th birthday, and there's other characters who are of similar age, and we grow with them, and they grow into some important roles in the book, and it's very fun to watch them grow into those roles. And I think Angie Sage did a really good job of doing that. I mentioned before the break that she does wrap up the things that were bugging me, that I felt like were not being wrapped up. And one thing that I really loved about all of these books is, in the end, it's not exactly an epilogue, but she gives you brief snippets of what happened to certain characters that you might not even have thought about again after they showed up. They could show up just briefly, a page or two. And so, there's XYZ character who showed up in chapter 5. And then at the end, XYZ character went on to do this and this and this. And the result of their actions was this. I love that. If you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you know that I want, an epilogue that is the length of War and Peace. I want to know what happens to everybody. I want to know everything that happens to everybody. Give me their history, or give me their future up until, 10 years after they're dead. I know that's not practical, but I hate leaving characters behind. I love, once the book is over, I still want to know what's going on. Books that end kind of open-endedly really make me sad sometimes, because I don't always want to use my own imagination. I want you to tell me what happened to these characters that I've grown to love, or these characters that I've grown to really dislike. Tell me what happened to them. So each book ends with multiple, I can't even tell you how many, like maybe 10, maybe between 10 and 20, just little snippets of what happened to these characters. So you've got magic, you've got witches, wizards, boggarts, dragons, magical creatures, magical places. You have got ghosts, like I said. There are talking rats. There's actually a talking rat who is one of the main characters. His name is Stanley, and he runs the message rat service, or he's part of the message rat service. And Stanley just keeps popping up in places that you don't expect him. So you get talking rats, and you really kind of get an insight into what it's like to be a rat in this time. Not sure exactly what time it's supposed to be. There's no countries named specifically. There, you feel like it's probably England, and Angie Sage is English, but and Snorri Snorkelson comes from the northern countries. She feels very Scandinavian, so you get ideas of where people are from, but there's no place names specifically given besides the North countries and the I think the place across the water or something like that. So it's very kind of specifically vague because it feels like places that you know in this world, but we're talking about magic and not technology. It's not modern. We don't have electricity. We don't have cars, but there's other things that, because of magic, may seem more technologically advanced. So, it could be one of those books that's like way in the future after we've had an apocalypse and everything's gone back to how it was, or it could be Middle Ages, who knows, or it could just be in a completely different world in a time before they have developed technology in a place that sounds a lot like England. It can be really wherever you want it to be, I think. And so Septimus Heap. And in the end, one of those, I'm not going to give anything away here, but one of those following up moments talks about a very, very brief, this person barely even got a paragraph. She just looked up in one of the books and saw one of the characters, and that was it. The character was passing by. She happened to see him passing by. And then in the end, it talks about how this character, Alice Todd Hunter Moon, because of that encounter, that brief encounter of seeing one of the characters pass by, wanted to find out more about the world and that person, etc. And so she gets her own series. I have not read those yet or listened to those yet. I am going to, but I haven't. So it's the Todd Hunter Moon series, and I think there's at least 3 of those. I could be wrong. So you get just this. She gets barely a mention. You don't even really think about her until the end when we're wrapping things up in this lovely way that I so appreciated and loved to find out about characters that I hadn't even thought about, but I loved finding out more about them. And one of those characters gets her own series. So the world of Septimus Heap is going to continue in this series. I did not mention that these books have been out for a while. You're probably thinking, yeah, I read those 10 years ago. Well, I'm behind on a lot of things. One of these days I'm going to run into myself coming or going because I'm so far behind in life. I'm just going to catch up to myself or run into the back of me. I don't know. Septimus Heap Book 1, I am looking to see when it was published, and it's 588 pages, but again, it's kind of larger type and there are a few pictures. So it's long, but and all of the books are of that kind of length. It was published in 2009, so it will be almost 10 years old, October 13th, 2009, so it's almost 10 years old. And then the Todd Hunter Moon books came out after that. Angie Sage, according to her Amazon author biography, loves the sea, spooky old houses, and medieval England. Ms. Sage has created many books. She's created many books for children, including the Araminta Spooky series, which I also would like to read because I like the name Araminta Spooky. She's got a new book that just came out, or it's coming out in May. Let's see. You can purchase it, so it is now out, Rise of the Dragons. And then she's got the Septimus Heap books along with the Todd Hunter Moon books, and then the Araminta Spooky. Which I think it's Araminta Spooky in America and Araminta Spook in England. I think that's what I read. Yeah. So Araminta Spooky, the cover art looks a lot like, the Addams Family or one of those shows. The first book in the series is called My Haunted House, and Araminta Spooky lives in a wonderful old haunted house, but her crabby Aunt Tabby wants to move. Aunt Tabby is determined to sell their house. Araminta has to stop her. With the help of a haunted suit of armor called Sir Horace, a ghost named Edmund, and a lot of imagination, Araminta hatches a plan for an awful ambush that is so ghoulish it just might work. Yes, I need to read these as well. So one of these days you may be hearing me talk about the Araminta Spooky series. I'll definitely be talking about Todd Hunter Moon at some point in the, I don't know, near future. It really just depends on when I get to them in the midst of everything else. I hope you're having a wonderful weekend. It's almost over. East Coast people, it pretty much is over for you, but West Coast people, you got a few more hours. So soak up that Sunday night enjoyment, and hope tomorrow is not too Monday of a Monday for everyone. I thank you as always for joining me for this episode. Hope you'll join me again for our next episode of the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Take some time, whether you are having a Monday or not, and get lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.